Hi, I'm Thomas Graves, and welcome to the Black Mold of Grief. My second mom, who raised me and my four siblings after my first mom passed, her name was Lois, and like my first mom, she was born and raised in Pittsburgh. Unlike my first mom, she did not have a big, extended, close-knit family. When I was visiting her mom, Zella, down in Florida, my brother Chuck and sister Catherine went down there when I was in seventh grade one summer to go to Disney World. And we were talking with her, and my grandmother Zella, told us the story about my Aunt Joanne, which was my mom's older sister. And when Zella was 17 or 18, she was married to a gentleman of the same age, and they had Aunt Joanne, who was fairly just born, and her husband had gone out New Year's Eve, enjoyed New Year's Eve to the full extent and didn't make it home the next day till late in the afternoon. And Zella was angry with him for not coming home. So she had already changed the locks. And when he tried to get in the house, he couldn't because his key didn't work. And she told him through the door that if he couldn't make it home, then he didn't need to come home. And that was the end of that relationship, and he never came back home. And so 10 years later, Zella was dating the man that was my mom's dad. They were not married. Zella was Catholic, the gentleman was Jewish, and my mom was born, and her dad spent half of the time with them and then half the time with his parents. And the relationship lasted several years because they had a second child, my Uncle Sonny, 2 years later. And then when my mom was 5, her dad's mom told him flat out that you need to quit messing around with that Catholic girl and go get a real family. And so he just never came back. So my mom grew up without a dad. And then it wasn't until my brother Chuck's wedding that we actually found out that there was another gentleman who did end up marrying Zella and raising my mom and Uncle Sonny and Aunt Joanne. And we discovered it because when Chuck was addressing the invitations, Uncle Sonny had a different last name than my mom, and we knew that they had the same dad. And so Uncle Sonny told my dad, and Uncle Sonny told my brother Chuck that since his dad had abandoned them and Mr. O'Connell was a great dad, he requested that his name be changed to O'Connell to honor the man that raised him. But my mom wanted a relationship with her dad, and she felt that if she changed her name, that if and when she reached out, if she had a different name, that he would reject her. So she kept his name so that he would have the relationship with her. At some point, Mr. O'Connell got sick, and he was sick for about 2 years, and they converted the living room to basically a hospital room, and there was a hospital bed in the living room. And then after he passed, at some point, Uncle Sonny joined the Army, and I think Aunt Joanne was already married. And when my mom graduated high school, she wanted to go to college and then to med school and wanted to be a doctor. And she was smart. She could have absolutely done all that. But Zella needed my mom to get a job and live at home to help her pay the bills. So my mom agreed to do that. And so she kind of gave up on the life that she wanted so that she could do that. And she got a job as a secretary at J&L Steel, which is where she would eventually meet my dad. And then in her early 20s, she did reach out to her dad, and they started having lunch or dinner on a regular basis and getting to know each other. And after a while, she got up a nerve and asked him if she could meet her grandmother and her siblings. And her dad kind of froze for a second and said, well, let me ask. And the next time they met, he said, my mom said no, that you just want to meet us so that we can give you money. And that really broke my mom's heart. And the next thing I found about my mom wasn't really till after she passed. And it was a couple years after she passed. And I was talking to my dad, and he started reminiscing and telling me about their first date. And my first mom passed in May of 68. And so by October of 68, my first mom's sister and her husband, Aunt Marianne and Uncle Frank, were trying to get my dad moving again because he was kind of in a funk. So they decided that they would give him Steelers tickets because they had season tickets. And they said, well, we'll give him tickets and maybe he'll, get a date and go on a date. And they did. And so my dad was at work, didn't know who to ask. And everybody at work said, well, you should ask Lois. And my dad said, well, she's been dating that guy for 5 years and she's not single. And they said, well, no, she broke up with him in July. And my dad said, well, I thought they were supposed to get engaged at Christmas. And they said, yeah, well, in July, she found out that he had been cheating on her for the last 5 years because my mom had told him she wasn't going to sleep with him until they got married. And for the 5 years, he had been very supportive of that, or my mom thought. And then she found out he had been cheating on her the whole time with the next girlfriend. So he asked my mom out, and they went out, and they ended up getting married 2 years later. I didn't know all that, obviously, when I was 4. And so when they got married, that's actually when my memories really started. My first real memory was when I was standing in a parking lot of a church in a suit. And so I believe that was their wedding. And my early memories of my new mom were good. I was still young enough that I was at home with her during the day while all of my siblings were at school. And my mom was very artistic and really had an eye for stuff, and she could sew, and later in life she painted, and it was pretty amazing. But what I remember is coming in the living room one day, and she was recovering the sofa, and it was 1970, I think. And so she had chosen this purple paisley fabric that was this deep purple, and there were big squares of fabric all over. And I was holding my Winnie the Pooh, and she was kneeling on the floor measuring and cutting, and I just said, Pooh's cold because he doesn't have any pants. And so she just kind of turned around and smiled and said, well, let's make him some pants. And so she came over with her measuring tape, and she measured him, and she made him some purple paisley pants to go with his bright red Pooh shirt. And I don't know what happened to that Pooh, but he was the only Pooh in the world that had purple paisley pants to go with his bright red shirt. And then my other memory at that time was, I guess a year later, I started going to half-day kindergarten and in the morning, and we went to a Wonder Bread factory one day on a field trip, and I came home with 2 loaves that they gave everybody fresh off the line. And when I gave them to my mom, she kneeled down and she said, how about we make sandwiches with the fresh bread, and we won't tell anybody, and we'll tie it up and stick it behind the old bread, and we'll get the fresh bread, and everybody else can eat the old bread. So she was definitely making me feel special, and making those moments. And then the other memory in Pittsburgh I have is she was apparently washing the drapes, and so she had taken the shears off and kind of laid them on the ground, and we had a little schnauzer named Sebastian, and he had decided to take a nap on the shears. And I guess at the time I had a real bad habit of interrupting my mom because I was trying to get Sebastian off the shears. I didn't think he should be sleeping on him because he might get him dirty. And so my mom was on the phone in the kitchen and I didn't want to interrupt her. And I was making a really clear effort not to interrupt her. So I decided to handle this all by myself. So I start yanking the shears out from underneath Sebastian, which of course, when you start yanking something from a dog, he of course bites it. And so we're in this tug of war and the shears start shredding. And I start yanking harder and he's yanking harder. And then finally his growl gets loud enough that my mom hears it. And so she says, to whoever she's talking to, hang on, I got to check something out. So she comes in and just sees this thing just shredded. And she says, what happened? Why didn't you come get me? And I was very innocent. I just said, I was trying not to interrupt you. And she just looked at me and she said, okay, you did a great job not interrupting me. But now let's talk about what an emergency is. About a year after that, my dad had an offer and a promotion to move to Houston. And so we did. And after we moved to Houston, the memories started to shift a little bit. And my mom, partly because we were getting older, and I think she was wanting to teach us about life and whatnot. But I started to notice that when she would give us life lessons and even when she would compliment us, there seemed to be some kind of faraway pain that was triggering the life lesson or the compliment. And I noticed this in particular. One memory I had, I went to a friend's house one Saturday morning to play. And then when she picked me up afterwards and we were driving back home, she just kept saying how proud of me she was for remaining friends with him because his parents were getting a divorce. And I didn't even know what a divorce was, so I didn't know what she was talking about. But she just kept saying, there's a lot of his friends that are going to be mean to him and stop being friends with him because of his parents. And I'm really proud that you are not allowing that to impact your friendship. And she went on to talk about how mean kids could be. And again, I just could tell, I didn't know what, but I could tell at some point she was talking about something from her past, that she was remembering something. So much, much later, it hit me that in 1939, things were much, much different. Nowadays, blended families are normal, they're accepted. Single moms are respected and admired for their strength. Not so in 1939. 1939, single moms were whores, their children were bastards, and I've come to realize that that was my mom's pain. And that really clicked into place when I remembered another story that my grandmother shared with us, my grandmother Zella, when we were down in Florida, that even within her own family, she shared that at one point, my Uncle Sonny's wife actually called her a whore to her face. And they spent several years not talking, and I don't even know the whole story on who didn't talk to whom, but I just know there was this big divide within that family, and I realized that just shutting people out and not talking seemed to be the way they dealt with conflict in that branch of the family tree. And so I realized that that was my mom's pain, was being part of what we now call a blended family, because those were the times, and gossip and being rejected because of that. And so that led to a decision in the family that I think was with the best of intentions, but it kind of set me on a path that has caused a lot of black mold from which I needed to heal. And that was once we did move to Houston. I remember my parents sitting us down at the bottom of the stairs and telling us that this was the opportunity for a fresh start. Because at this point, we had had a new baby sister, Annie, and then in another couple of years, we had a baby brother, Matthew. And so we were becoming a blended family. And I think every parent's goal is to protect their children from the pain of their own childhood. And that was my mom's pain. And so her goal was to protect us from that. So they informed us that if we ever needed to discuss our first mom, we were welcome to do so in the house. But when we stepped outside the house, this was the only mom we ever had. And we were to convince all of our friends, new teachers, new neighbors that this was the only mom we ever had. I remember my dad sharing that our mom had memorized all of the facts about our births, not just the birth weight and the length and the time, but how long our first mom had been in labor, what time she went into labor, and all of that, because those were normal questions that she would be asked, and she wanted to be prepared so that she could kind of sell the story. And he talked about how she would have been 22 at the time that my first sister was born, which was still workable in the storyline of the family, and that her hair color was the same as our first mom's. And my sister Patty has blonde hair, which she had inherited from our grandmother, which was accurate anyway. So if anybody asked about Patty's hair color, she got it from our grandmother, which was true. And I remember my dad saying, if you act right, nobody will ever ask any questions. And so I didn't speak about my first mom until I was 30. And I didn't hang a picture of her in my house until I was 39. And the conflict for me really started a little while after I turned 16, because that's when I first heard the story about how I came to be, which is that my first mom made a promise and she kept it. And the conflict was I existed because she kept a promise. So I wanted to honor her by keeping my promises. But in order to keep my promise to my parents that I made when I was 6, I had to convince the world she never existed. And so what was the right way to honor her? Because if she broke her promise, I wouldn't exist. But if I kept my promise, she didn't exist. And I didn't know how to resolve that. So I just didn't. And that just lived inside of me till I was 39. When we reconnected with my first mom's family in 2005, that trip was great. It healed me in a lot of different ways. And one of the things I gained from that trip was a lot of compassion for my mom and dad, because I got to meet this huge extended family. But I also saw what my new mom and dad were up against, in the sense that it was a huge family and we all lived 10 minutes apart. It was a small town, a small township, and they deserved to have a life of their own and a fresh start. And there was really no way to do that within the context of that. And they deserved a fresh start. And so there really wasn't a good option. And had we stayed in Pittsburgh, had we tried to have a relationship with them, it would have just resulted in other tensions and conflicts. And so there wasn't really a good option. And so they made the best choice they could make. And it just didn't work out great for me, but it wasn't a decision that they made to hurt anyone. It was simply the best decision they could make. And the other realization I had a few years later, as I really got into the stages of grief and how they worked and what they were, I realized that they were published for the first time in 1969. And my mom passed away in 1968. And my second mom, all of the things she needed to grieve started happening in 1939 when she was born. And so what I now view as black mold started in 1939 and went all the way up to 1968. And what I call emotional technology of grieving to help prevent black mold didn't exist until 1969. So how would we have known how to grieve? Nobody knew that process existed because it hadn't been discovered yet. And I actually reached out to Dr. Kubler-Ross's son through the Kubler-Ross Foundation because I was wanting to get the sales figures for the first several years of the book On Death and Dying, which is where they were published. And he emailed back and forth a few times and very quickly, which I appreciate and was very surprised by, but he was very gracious. And he said that Simon & Schuster hasn't gone back and digitized those records. So he's tried to get the exact sales figures and he can't either. But he did say that On Death and Dying sold millions of copies. And so what I'm about to share is kind of made up sales figures. So I want to be clear on that. But just from a philosophical point, if it sold 1 million copies the first year in 1969, the U.S. population was 202 million, which means half of 1% of the U.S. population even knew about the stages of grief. And if the sales doubled year over year in 1972, total sales of the book would have been about 15 million. And the U.S. population was about 205 million, which would be 7.5%. So I don't judge our family for not knowing how to grieve because no one knew that we were allowed to grieve or how to grieve. And so that's part of why I'm doing this podcast is we were a good family. We are a good family who loved each other. We do love each other. We just hurt each other because we didn't know what to do with our pain. And now 50 years later, when I do talk about grief with different friends and whatnot, people kind of know about it and they know it exists, but they don't really know what those stages are and what they mean. And it isn't just about the physical loss of death, because what my second mom went through with the abandonment of her dad, with the rejection of her family when she was in her early 20s, when she wasn't allowed to meet them, with the breakdown of a 5-year relationship when she found out she was being cheated on, when she made the decision to stay home and support her mom, and she had to give up on the life she wanted in order to do that. All of those things were losses that all needed to be grieved. And that's why I look at grief as our basic emotional operating system. And I think people need to learn how to grieve everything. And that's kind of the approach I've taken. And so this is kind of a case study of what happens when you don't do that. And so that's why I'm doing this, so that other people don't make the mistakes we made and they avoid it by learning how to grieve. I have a lot to thank Marcelo for, and mostly it's taking the song from one song into an album. I had been struggling with which version to do, whether I wanted it to be a rock version or an R&B version, because at the time I was thinking conventionally that I should have one version. And for a bunch of different reasons, I decided just to do one version, which would be my version. And that was because there were 40,000 songs uploaded to Spotify every day. And I figured nobody would ever hear it. So I was just going to do my version. But I felt guilty about that because the thing I learned most about grief is that you have to grieve inside your comfort zone. And so I felt bad releasing it in a rock version because I'd be telling everybody else, you need to grieve inside of my version. And so when I reached out to Marcelo, his whole demo was in English. And so when he responded, he said, I love the song, want to do it. By the way, I actually am Brazilian, and so I sing in Portuguese. Let me know if you want me to do multiple versions. And as soon as I read the line multiple versions, like it just, the angels went, ah, and like it jumped off the page. And I was like, that's the whole thing. I can do multiple versions and everybody can grieve inside their own comfort zone. And so from that email, that's what spawned the whole album. And that was just incredible. And so that one moment shifted everything in and of itself. But then in addition to that, just his vocal is incredible. I just love the power and the passion, and he has this grit in his upper register that just really delivers the whole emotion that I was looking for when I asked him to join the project.
If I don't make a change, I'll meet you in the clouds, and this emptiness will be all I talk about. You would understand, but I'll be ashamed if you brought your smile and I brought my pain to our first conversation in heaven. And I wanna bring you joy. And I wanna bring you joy. I don't care how tough it is, I am gonna live, 'cause I wanna bring you joy.
Thank you for tuning into the Black Mold of Grief. Next week, I'm going to share about losing my friend Jenny. But in the meantime, I hope something I've said helps you bring a little more joy to your first conversation in heaven, and I hope to see you next time.